black wolf hit the snow on 3 legs and still came at the king's guards like a thunderclap. Iron snapped. A spear shattered. The king of the high pine stumbled back 2 steps, and the laughter in his throat went thin. He had marched his throne to the edge of the mountain and brought a girl in chains to watch the show. Now the show was watching him. The wolf turned its yellow eyes past the guards, past the king, and locked onto the man at the tree line who had not drawn a weapon. A man with frostbite on his cheek and a saddle slung over his shoulder. The king grinned through his teeth and shouted, "Tame my wolf, Alpha, and take my daughter." Why would a king feed his own beast a stranger from the low country? Stay with me on this one. His name was Cashin Rowe, and he had not come up the mountain looking for a king. He had come looking for a horse. The mare had broken loose 3 nights back when a slide buried half the trail, and Cashin had walked the ridges since dawn calling her name into the wind. He was a mountain man by trade, the kind who lived 9 months out of 12 in a cabin he had built with his own hands above the timberline, where the air thinned and the stars hung close enough to burn your eyes. He trapped beaver in spring and elk in fall. He read weather off the necks of crows. He had a hard, soft face, the kind that smiled slow and meant it. Folks down in the valley called him strange, because he talked to animals and the animals seemed to talk back. Cashin did not mind being strange. He minded being cold, and he minded losing his mare. So when he crested the saddle between the 2 pines and saw smoke rising in a place no smoke ought to rise, he stopped and crouched and watched. What he saw was a court. A real court, the kind in old paintings, with banners stitched in silver and a tall chair carved out of pale wood. A king sat on it in a wolfskin cloak. Round him stood 12 guards in iron caps and 12 more men in long coats with hawks on their wrists. And in front of the chair, on her knees in the snow, was a young woman with a chain around her throat. She was not crying. She was watching the trees. Cashin had been raised to mind his own business in the high country. The mountains do not love men who meddle. He almost turned around. But the woman lifted her head, and her eyes found him through the pines as if she had been waiting for him to arrive. Brown eyes steady, with a small spark of fury at the back of them. Then a sound came out of the trees on the other side of the clearing. A low, grinding growl that rolled across the snow like rocks rolling down a slope. The king stood up and clapped his hands. "Bring it out," he called, and 2 men dragged a heavy wooden cage to the center of the camp. Inside, pacing, was the biggest black wolf Cashin had ever seen. Its left foreleg had been crushed at some point and not set. Its lip was split. There were old whip marks across its ribs, white with new fur trying to grow over them. The wolf did not bark. It did not even snarl. It only watched the king with a patience that was somehow worse than rage. The king turned to his daughter and said, loud enough for the whole mountain to hear, "You will marry the man who tames it. Or you will marry the man who survives it." The young woman did not answer him. She looked once more at the trees. Then she said something soft, almost to herself, and Cashin could not hear it, but he saw her lips move. He thought she said, "Please." He set down his saddle behind a stone. He took off his thick outer coat and folded it once. He left his rifle leaning against the pine. A rifle would not help him here. Not with a beast like that. Not with a king like that. He stepped out of the trees with his hands open at his sides, and the whole camp went quiet at once. The king saw him first and laughed. He laughed the way men laugh when they are not really amused, when laughter is a kind of armor. "Look," he said, "the mountain has sent us a beggar." The guards turned with their spears half raised. The hawks on the long coats lifted their feathered shoulders and fixed Cashin with their hard, gold-rimmed stares. The young woman in the snow did not turn. She was looking at the cage. Cashin walked forward slow. He did not look at the king. He did not look at the guards. He looked at the wolf. The wolf looked back. There is a thing that passes between an animal and a man sometimes, in the half-second before either of them decides what to do. Cashin had felt it with hawks, with elk, with the lone gray cat that lived under his porch one winter. He had never felt it as strong as he felt it now. The wolf's yellow eyes narrowed, then softened the smallest amount, then locked. It was the look of an animal that had been promised something a long time ago and was finally seeing the promise in the flesh. Easy, Cashin said quietly, more for himself than the wolf. Easy now. Stranger, the king called, you have walked into the middle of a wedding. Are you here to give the bride away? The court chuckled politely. Cashin did not stop walking. He kept his hands open. He came to within 5 paces of the cage and stopped. The wolf's chest moved like a bellows. Up close, Cashin could see the cage was a cruel one. The bars had been sharpened on the inside. Every time the wolf lunged at them, it cut itself. Old blood crusted on iron. Whoever had built this cage had wanted the animal hurt before the fight even began. Cashin felt something cold and slow turn over in his stomach. He turned finally and faced the king. He still kept his hands open. Your Majesty, he said, that wolf is hurt. The king tilted his head. Of course it is hurt, he said. It is to be killed. Hurt makes the killing simpler. Cashin nodded as if that were a reasonable thing to say. He had learned long ago that you do not argue with armed men in the first minute of meeting them. You let them feel large. Then you set the trap. He looked back at the wolf. He looked at the young woman. He looked at the king. May I, he asked, ask one question? The king spread his hands. Ask. What did the wolf do? Cashin said. The court rustled. The king's mouth moved before his face did. It killed my hunters, he said. 6 of them. In the high passes. It killed them and dragged what was left into the rocks and would not give the bones back. He smiled with all his teeth. Do you know what kind of beast does that, mountain man? Cashin tipped his head a little. He thought about the slide that had buried his trail 3 nights back. He thought about the hawks on the long coats. He thought about the cage. He said, a mother. There was a long quiet. The king's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. The young woman in the snow finally turned her head. Her brown eyes found Cashin's again. The small spark of fury at the back of them flared, then steadied into something almost like hope. Bring out the saddle, the king said suddenly to one of his men. The mountain man wishes to ride. We will give him a chance. We will give him a saddle. The court laughed again, easier this time, glad to be back on familiar ground. The man fetched a small, ugly iron rig from a wagon. It was not a saddle for a horse. It was a brace, with hooks and short spikes meant to be cinched across an animal's spine. Cashin had seen such things before, in the bear pits down south. He had never seen one used on a wolf. They strapped that to the beast, a guard explained, almost kindly, and you ride it 3 times around the chair. If you stay on, you marry the king's daughter and walk away with a purse of silver. If you fall off, my lord's hawks pick the bones. Cashin did not look at the iron rig. He looked at the cage. He looked at the wolf. He looked at the young woman. He said, I will ride it. But first I will set the leg. The king laughed for a long time at that. When he was done, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and he said, set the leg then, mountain man. Set the leg. We will see how brave you are with no bars between you. He waved at the guards. The guards lifted the front of the cage. The wolf did not charge. That was the first thing that surprised the court. It stood in the open mouth of the cage and breathed and watched. Cashin dropped to one knee in the snow, about 2 paces in front of it. He set his hands on his thighs, palms down, the way a man sits at a table when he is asking a favor. He spoke low. He used the kind of voice he used with the elk in the meadow above his cabin, the soft sounds with no hard edges. The wolf's ears moved, the smallest twitch. Its yellow eyes flicked once to the king, then back to Cashin. There were 2 breaths, 3, 4, where the whole mountain seemed to wait. Then the black wolf walked, 3 legs in the dragged forth out of the cage. It walked past Cashin without touching him. It went to the young woman in the snow and lay down beside her. It put its great heavy head across her knees. The young woman, who had not cried at any point that morning, made a single small sound, and her hand went into the wolf's fur as if she had done it 100 times. The court did not laugh now. The king's face went white at the edges and hot in the center. He stood up out of his pale wood chair. "That," he said. "That." He could not seem to find the next word. Cashin stood up slow. He brushed the snow off his knee. He looked at the king with a face that had gone in the last half-minute, very calm and very tired. He said, "You knew." The king did not speak. Cashin said, "You knew that wolf belonged to her. You raised them up the same year, didn't you? You let her run him in the woods when she was small. Then you found her standing in some glade somewhere with her hand on his neck, and it scared you, and you took him into the mountains and let him go. And he did not go. He stayed. He hunted near her window. He killed the men you sent to chase him off, because they came at him with iron and dogs. And the longer he stayed near, the more it became something you could not allow. So you brought them both up here to end it. Together, where the mountain itself would forget." The king lifted one hand, and Cashin saw the hand was shaking. "Hush," the king said. The hawks on the long coats had gone very still on their handlers' wrists. The guards held their spears. None of them moved. The young woman lifted her face. She said, "His name is Vesper." The wolf, hearing the name, made a low sound deep in his chest, not a growl, more like a man sighing in his sleep. "My name is Lyra," the young woman said. She was looking at Cashin. "I prayed for you," she said. "I did not know what you would look like. I am sorry the prayer was so heavy." Cashin almost smiled. He bowed his head a small amount, the way mountain men do instead of making promises. He said, "I am Cashin Rowe, and I keep a cabin 3 valleys over. There is a fire in it now, banked low. There is room for 2 and a wolf." The king made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when something he has been pretending not to know has finally been spoken out loud, and he cannot pretend anymore. He sat back down on his pale wood chair so heavily that the chair creaked. The court was silent. The guards were silent. The hawks were silent on the long coats. For the space of perhaps 15 long breaths, the only sound in the camp was the wind moving in the high pines. Then the king lifted his head. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the black wolf. He looked at the mountain man kneeling in the snow. And then, very slowly, very carefully, the king began to smile again. It was not the same smile. It was a thinner smile, a colder smile. It was the smile of a man who has just remembered that he is not alone on this mountain, and that he has brought with him more than guards. Cashin saw the smile. Cashin saw, behind the smile, 2 of the long-coated men slip backward into the trees, hawks first. He felt the false calm settle over the clearing, the way snow settles after a slide. Quiet, almost peaceful. He knew what quiet like that meant. He had heard it before, in the breath between the first crack of ice and the moment the lake gives way. He stood up slowly, and he stepped very gently between Lyra and the king. The black wolf did not get up. He only lifted his great head off her knees and watched the trees where the long-coated men had gone. 3 crows lifted off the high branches without a sound and flew away east. The wind dropped. Somewhere far off, a bell began to ring, slow and even, the way bells ring when a man wants other men to come. The first arrow came out of the pines and missed Cashin's shoulder by the width of a finger. It buried itself in the pale wood of the king's chair. The king did not flinch. He had been expecting it. The thin, cold smile did not move from his mouth. Cashin moved. He had Lyra up off the snow in a single pull, and behind the trunk of the nearest pine before the second arrow hissed past. The wolf came with them. 3 legs, a dragged forth, but he came faster than 3-legged things have any right to come, and he put his body between Lyra and the open ground. Across the clearing, the king finally stood up out of his chair. He raised one hand, the way a man raises his hand to start a race. The long-coated men in the trees began to move. There were not 2 of them anymore. There were 8, maybe 10. They had been hidden in the pines since before Cashin had walked into the camp, ready for exactly this hour, exactly this signal. The king had never meant to give his daughter to anyone. The king had never meant to let the wolf be tamed. He had meant to put a story at the top of the mountain. The story of a beast that killed a princess and a stranger and was put down by hawks. A story is a useful thing to a king who is losing his grip on the low country. A story is an easy thing to tell when there are no witnesses left to tell another one. Cashin understood all of this in about the time it took him to load his rifle, which was not much time at all. He had grabbed it on the way past the pine where he had left it. Lyra crouched behind him with her hands in Vesper's fur, and her face had gone the particular color of a mountain sky just before a storm, gray pale and very quiet. He said, "Stay low." She said, "Give me the knife at your belt." He gave it to her without arguing. He liked her more for asking. The first long-coated man came around the far side of the cage, with a hawk already lifting off his glove. Cashin shot him in the shoulder, on purpose, not the chest. The man went down hard. The hawk veered up into the pines, confused, looking for a hand. The second man came at a low run from the left, and Vesper, who had not moved his eyes off that direction in 2 whole minutes, exploded sideways out of the snow with a sound that was not a growl and not a bark. It was something older. The man went down, and he did not get up. Cashin did not look. He was watching the king. The king had not moved from in front of his chair. He was watching Cashin back. He lifted his hand again. A third long-coated man stepped out of the pines, almost directly behind Lyra. Cashin saw him a half-second too late. He turned, and he saw Lyra was already turning too, and the knife in her hand came up in a short, hard line under the long coat and stopped the man cold. He folded down into the snow beside her, like a coat falling off a hook. Lyra did not look at him after. She looked at Cashin. Her eyes were very big and very steady. She said, "I have been waiting a long time to do that." Cashin said, "I believe you." He turned back to the king. The remaining long-coated men had stopped at the edge of the trees. They had seen the third one fall. They had seen Vesper rise up out of the snow with the second one's coat in his teeth. They had seen the mountain man with the steady rifle and the princess with the bloody knife. They were brave men in their way, but they were not stupid men. They looked to the king for the next signal. The king did not give one. The king was, Cashin realized, looking past him. Cashin half-turned. Out of the trees on the eastern slope, where the slow, even bell had been ringing, came men. Not court men. Not long-coated men. Mountain men. Trappers in heavy old coats. 2 old guides with long rifles laid across their forearms. A blacksmith Cashin knew from the valley below, his great hammer at his hip. A woman with a brace of dogs that did not bark. They came up the slope in no particular order and stopped at the tree line and waited. The crows had flown east. The bell had rung. Word travels on a mountain in ways that flat country kings never quite understand. The king saw them. He counted them. He did the small private arithmetic that kings do. He lowered his hand. The long-coated men, very slowly, stepped back into the trees. The guards in iron caps lowered their spears and looked at their boots. The hawks settled on the gloves of their handlers and folded their wings. Cashin lowered his rifle, but did not let it go. He said, loud enough to carry across the clearing, "You will leave this mountain before sundown. You will not come back. If you come back, the mountain will keep you. Is that understood?" The king did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, the way a man speaks when he is choosing his words for later, "You have made me a problem, mountain man." Cashin said, "You made yourself a problem, your majesty. I just declined to be part of the solution. If you want a real story to tell, you can tell that one." "Friend," the king said, and the word was thin and bright and bitter as a knife pulled out of cold water. "You have no idea what you have begun." Cashin said, "Maybe not. But I know what I have ended." He looked at Lyra. He looked at Vesper. He looked at his neighbors waiting at the tree line. He said, "You ended yours." If this video has held you so far, take a second to subscribe. There is more story to come. The king turned slowly and walked back to his pale wood chair. He did not sit down on it. He simply put his hand on its arm, the way a man puts his hand on the back of a horse he is about to leave. Then he turned, and he walked down the trail toward the low country, and his guards and his long-coated men and his hawks and his banners followed him in a long, uneven line. None of them looked back. The black wolf watched them go until the last banner was gone behind the second ridge. Only then did he lower his head. For a long minute nobody on the mountain moved. The wind lifted a thin curtain of snow off the ridge and dropped it. Then the blacksmith from the valley below walked across the open ground and stopped beside Cashin. He looked at Lyra, at Vesper, at the bloody knife, and nodded as if it answered a question he had been carrying. He said, "I rang the bell." Cashin said, "I owe you." The blacksmith said, "You owe me nothing. I owed your father, and your father is gone, and the debt comes to you, and I am paying it now." Cashin had not heard his father's name in 5 winters. He said, "Thank you." The blacksmith said, "He will not come tonight. He will come in spring with more men, and he will come quiet." Cashin said, "I know." The blacksmith said, "We will be ready." Then he walked back to the trappers without waiting for an answer. Cashin knelt in the snow beside Vesper. He spoke low again, the same soft sound, the ones with no edges. He laid his hand very gently on the crushed foreleg. Vesper's whole body tensed. His yellow eyes went hard. But he did not snap. He only watched Cashin's face, and after a long second he gave a single small nod with his great heavy head, as a horse will do when it has decided to trust a man. Cashin looked up at Lyra. He said, "I will need you to hold his head. Talk to him. Tell him whatever you would tell him at home." She knelt in the snow on the other side of the wolf, and she put her forehead against his, and she began to whisper. Cashin did not listen to the words. They were not his to listen to. He worked the leg with both hands. He felt, under the matted fur and the swollen flesh, the small wrong shapes of bones that had been broken months ago and never set. He took a long breath. He pulled. Vesper made one sound, low and short, the way a man makes a sound when a friend stitches a wound for him. Then it was done. Cashin wrapped the leg in strips torn from the king's banner, which one of the trappers had cut down and brought over. The silver thread was good for splinting, the trapper said dryly, almost the only joke any of them made all afternoon. They built a fire in the center of the camp, where the pale wood chair had been. They burned the chair. They burned the iron riding rig with the spikes. They burned the cage. The bars cracked in the heat and fell apart, and the old crusted blood on them turned to nothing. The mountain men did not say much. They never did. The blacksmith looked at Lyra and said, "You will be wanting somewhere to sleep tonight, miss." Lyra looked at Cashin. Cashin looked at the fire. He said, "I keep a cabin 3 valleys over. It is small. It is warm. There is room for 2 and a wolf." Lyra said, "Then that is where I am going." The blacksmith nodded once, the way mountain men nod when a thing has been settled, and he went to fetch his dogs. They walked down off the high pines as the light began to turn. Cashin carried the saddle. Lyra walked beside him with her hand in Vesper's ruff, and Vesper limped, but he walked, and he held his head up. The trappers and the old guides and the blacksmith and the woman with the dogs walked behind them, in no particular order, until the trail forked, and one by one each of them peeled off toward their own valley with no goodbyes. Mountain men do not say goodbye much. They say see you, or they say keep warm, and that is enough. The cabin was just where Cashin had left it. The fire had burned down to a soft orange heart. He built it back up. Lyra stood in the doorway with her hand still in Vesper's fur and looked around at the small, clean room. The hung herbs, the shelf of books, the kettle, the 2 chairs. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, very quiet, "I have never been in a room that did not have a guard at the door." Cashin said, "There is no guard here. There is a wolf." She laughed. It was a small sound, surprised, the way a person laughs when they have forgotten they could. Vesper limped to the rug in front of the fire and lay down on it as if he had always meant to. He sighed once, the long, deep sigh of a creature laying down a heavy thing he has been carrying for years, and then he closed his yellow eyes. Cashin made tea. They drank it slow. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet and even, the way snow falls when the wind has gone home. Lyra said, after a while he will come back. My father. He does not let go of things. Cashin said, I know. She said, what will we do? Cashin thought about it. He looked at Vesper sleeping on the rug. He looked at Lyra in the firelight. He said, we will be ready. Then he said, and we will not be alone. The mountain knows us. It knows him too. They sat with that for a while. The fire ticked. The kettle settled. The black wolf dreamed, his crushed leg twitching once and then steadying. After a long time, Lyra said, Cashin. He looked at her. She said, thank you for coming up the mountain. He said, I came up looking for a horse. She said, I know. That is why it worked. Because you were not coming for a king. He thought about that. He thought it was the truest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. Outside the cabin, the snow kept falling. Somewhere far down the mountain, a king rode toward the low country and made plans that would, in time, bring him back. But that was a story for another night. Tonight there were 2 chairs by a fire, and a wolf on a rug and tea in 2 cups, and a door that no guard stood at. Cashin rose, set down his cup. He went to the door and dropped the bar across it. Not against the king. Against the cold. He came back to the fire. He sat down. He looked at Lyra a long moment, the way a man looks at a thing he is still not quite ready to believe. He said, in the morning I will go down to the blacksmith, and I will tell him you are here. He will tell 2 others. They will tell 2 more. By the end of the week the whole valley will know, and by the end of the month the high passes will know, and your father will hear it last of all, because the mountain tells its own news in its own time. Lyra said, will they keep us? Cashin said, they will not need to keep us. They will only need to know we are theirs. That is how it works up here. He looked at the fire. He said, you will need a coat. A real one. I will trade for it tomorrow. And boots. And a smaller knife than mine, for the inside of your sleeve. Lyra smiled at that, a slow, real smile, the first one of the day. She said, you think of practical things. He said, practical things are how you stay alive in a country that does not care if you do. She thought about it. She said, I have only ever lived in countries that cared too much. He said, you will like this one better. Outside the snow kept falling, soft and even. Vesper turned once on the rug and settled deeper. Lyra leaned forward and held her hands out to the fire, and Cashin saw, for the first time, that the chain mark on her throat was already beginning to fade in the warm light. He said, we are home. And the black wolf, half asleep, thumped his tail once on the rug, as if to say, yes, we are.